it's a big moment. We have him on the show all the time, but he came all the way in from Cedarville, and boy, are his arms tired. He flew all the way. Something like that. Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. Thank you for coming all the way in.
It's my pleasure. If I had flown from Cedarville, I'd probably get some questions for my administration, just to be clear.
You can take the Cedarville private jet?
Yeah, we use that for recruiting, sure.
So it's a fun time to be a political science professor, I would imagine, right now.
Can you define fun?
So in two senses of the word,
yeah, it's
right?
interesting.
This is like your Super Bowl, a presidential election season. It's what people are thinking about politics.
Sure.
And yet you might, fun as in, I can't believe people think all these things that aren't true, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Super Bowl is one analogy. Another one might be an accountant during tax season. A lot of work to do, and you're always kind of shaking your head and trying to make sense of reality and just move forward. So it is a lot of fun. It's interesting, and that's why I enjoy being a political scientist and not a historian. Things just keep happening, and you always have to sort of rethink and reevaluate, and it's fun.
And my daughter is a junior this year, and she's taking a government class. And I often wonder whether we don't offer enough civics in our K-12 education. What's your thought on that?
I'm not sure that it's a question of quantity. I think it's probably more a question of quality. I think most of the students that I teach have had a civics course of some kind, but then when I sort of dig below the surface a little bit, those civics courses are generally just current events classes where maybe the teacher isn't all that invested in the material, but just wants to talk about the latest poll or the latest event that took place. And so I think the students really aren't getting what I would call a quality civics education necessarily. So more would be better, maybe, but if more is just simply bad classes, I'm not sure it'll help. Yeah, and not trying to besmirch all the social studies teachers out there. A lot of them are great and do a wonderful job, but I mean, I think on average, I would say we're probably struggling a bit.
Well, and to be honest, I was a social studies teacher for 6 school years in high school, and I was part of a scope and sequence committee, as they call it, which sounds just as exciting as it actually was. But our job was to determine on behalf of the entire school district what courses would we teach and when would we teach them. And to be honest, most high school and middle school teachers that teach social studies just want to teach American history. That's all they want to do.
Right.
Every year.
Yeah. I think that's fair. And when you look at, they generally have to teach history, some econ, some government, and maybe even some psychology or sociology. And most of them are really strong in history, but the rest of it is a little bit more of a challenge.
And me advocating for more geography, people were just kind of like, no, I don't think we want to do that. I was like, really? So it's too bad. You're right, because I think if we spent more time, not on current events in government courses, but more time in, how does the American government system work?
Yeah.
And why was it set up that way by the founders? Might not be as much fun as current events, but it's so important. And I think a lot of people don't understand the why.
Yeah, I think as a professor, the why question is the most interesting question. And it's the one that you should spend most of your time on. It's not about facts. It's not about information. It's about why, which is something much more fundamental. And I think ultimately gets to current events, but it gets there in a very different, slower, more deliberate direction. And so if you want to understand current events, understanding why the system works the way that it does is a good start. But understanding the current event all by itself, I think you're just sort of floating on the surface. Got to go a little deeper.
Which is why I think an interesting starting place would be the Electoral College. We're up against a presidential election. Almost every presidential election in the last few decades, somebody complains about the Electoral College when it's over. People are like, this thing is so dumb. Why do we have it? Shouldn't a popular vote just count? So first of all, what is the Electoral College?
So we do not directly elect presidents. So when you and I go into the voting booth and do whatever we do in our voting booth, punch a button, pull a lever, whatever it is, we're technically voting for an elector from our state who will then cast a vote in December to determine who's the president of the United States. And so the popular vote decides which group of electors get to vote. Those electors cast ballots, and then those ballots are counted, and we get a president out of that. So it's not a popular vote system, but the popular vote affects the system pretty dramatically, but it's not purely a popular vote system. And so,
yeah, what's wrong with the founders? That's so dumb. Do they hate people?
If you are driven by democracy, that's the right question. Why weren't they more democratic? Why didn't they just want a popular system where we just all get together, we vote, and that's the end of it? They were nervous about democracy. They were uncomfortable with the idea that the people all by themselves would have all the authority. And they wanted some checks and balances in the system to prevent the people from maybe making rash decisions. And the Electoral College is one of those mechanisms. There was discussion at the Constitutional Convention about directly electing the president. That did not go far because the president was going to have so much power. They'd already dealt with the king. They knew they were going to have to invest this person with a great amount of authority, and they were worried about demagogues. They were worried about people abusing the system, getting elected, and then just abusing their authority. And so the Electoral College is one way they tried to mitigate that reality. Has it worked? I think that's a good question. But the system was really designed to prevent a little bit of a buffer with people.
And some people are shocked that you would imply the founders didn't trust the people.
I don't know how else to draw the conclusions. I mean, you look at the system itself. Look at what they designed. We have the judiciary, we have the executive, we have the legislative branch. Of those three branches, only one part of one branch was directly elected by the people initially, and that was the House. The Senate was chosen by state legislatures, president's chosen by an electoral college, judiciary is chosen by president and the Senate. And so they're two steps removed from the people. That's all by design. The people are sovereign in our system, but sovereign doesn't mean they get to snap their fingers and everything happens.
In studio with us all the way till 8 o'clock, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. And he loves Jesus. So from a faith perspective, nonpartisan along with us, we're talking politics, and you can text in your question. 440-546-2255. You can call, too, if you want.
Yeah, you can.
So what do you have for us, Lauren?
Why do presidential candidates make promises knowing Congress writes and passes the laws?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Because voters like to hear promises. That's really what it comes down to. I mean, if we really wanted the truth out of our presidential candidates, we would enforce it and we would vote accordingly based on truth. But since we don't do that, they have a really strong incentive to tell us what we want to hear. And even if we try to be gracious, let's be as gracious as we possibly can toward our candidates. When they make a promise, they're really promising what they're going to attempt to do. But they really can't promise an outcome. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to make it clear when we listen to them that there's no guarantee that this thing is going to happen. As we've seen even with executive orders with President Biden, you can make an executive order. That doesn't mean it's going to work. That doesn't mean the Supreme Court's going to say you have the authority to do that. Working with Congress is another factor that goes into it. Presidents that don't have the support of Congress are by definition neutered when it comes to domestic policy and will probably get very little done. And so, yeah, I wish the presidential candidates would be a little bit more forthright about those things. But I lament to say that there's not always an incentive to be forthright.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's an element at which the strategy to win student council president doesn't change even when you're running for president of the United States, as in, I'm going to make school lunch taste better. And the whole place goes, that's it. We're voting for him.
Pizza for lunch every day.
Right.
And it's not true.
Yeah.
But they know that you'll like to hear that.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say voters, even if voters get concerned about that, they don't always remember. People who don't do this for a daily job, who aren't plugged into the political process on a regular basis, don't keep a running tally of what candidate X said in the debate, and then 3 months later think about that when they go to the voting booth. I kind of wish they did sometimes, but they don't. And so for many voters, when they go into that voting booth, they're reacting to sort of recent information and they're processing it and they're making a decision. And I think it's generally a rational decision, but it isn't always loaded with like back end information that they've been tabulating over the years. That's just not how most people process politics.
Very good. What's next, Lauren?
How can someone say that they are a Christian and vote for someone that is pro-choice?
So it's a great question. I think it's a very important question. So there are a lot of layers to it, and we could spend the whole time talking about this question. So if you guys want to head different directions, that's fine. A couple of things. I think first, a vote is not a complete endorsement of values in the sense that I have lots of values as a person, as a believer, as a political thinker, but a vote is a simplistic choice. It's a crude tool. I'm choosing between two people. Maybe I'm going to write someone in or vote for a third party, but I have limited options when I cast that ballot. Almost by definition, that ballot is not going to reflect all of my values.
It can't possibly.
It can't, because no candidate, no party reflects all of my values. If we look at biblical values, there's a wide range of biblical values that neither party really fully encapsulates. And so because of that, when I vote, I'm making compromises all the time. Now, the question is a good one, though. Something as important as abortion, is that something that you compromise on? I think that's a fair question. One thing I think that's a little different now is the president's very unlikely to be able to do much about abortion policy. It's been pushed to the states. States are driving the train when it comes to abortion. Presidential candidates have strong opinions about it. They've said that they're going to sign a federal law, either way, potentially. But I think the Senate, if it stays the way that it is, I can't see a Senate getting to 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, which we can talk about, which is what it would take to codify or to roll back Roe v. Wade at the federal level. And so to some degree, I think this is an empty promise. And so I think abortion is critical, obviously, but I think it's much more of a state-driven issue right now. And so I could see how a Christian might say, well, this candidate represents all my values. I don't think abortion is really a relevant issue now at the federal level. Therefore, it's just not part of my thought process. And you could also argue, potentially, this candidate's pro-choice, but the Supreme Court has already made its decision, and I'm kind of going to put that issue aside for now and vote based on other factors. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with how that reasoning goes, but I don't think it's always fair to say that reasoning reflects a pro-choice preference. There's a lot of complications that go into a vote.
Yeah, and I think it's also reflective of a philosophy of how to vote, right? Like some people are single issue voters.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's because as you're saying, you look at a candidate and you can't have them agree with you on everything. You have to pick something, right? And for some people, they pick something else. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair. Some people would look at it, and again, we could argue about what's the right way, if there is a right way. I don't think there is. And say, I really want the government to be more proactive on economics to help take care of people who can't care for themselves. And therefore, I think I'm going to lean more toward the left, which would make more of a Democratic vote potentially. So for them, abortion just may not be as big of an issue. Or they might reason more social benefits leads to fewer abortions because it puts people in a better economic situation. And therefore, they're trying to limit abortions through economic policy. And so again, we could argue about whether that's a good way of thinking, but it's not irrational.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've heard it as well. But I've heard people on both sides of the aisle say, how can you be a Christian and vote for fill in the blank? Like both sides ask that question. And I think once one steps back away from themselves in their own situation and says, this question is legitimately asked by both sides, I must have to think about this more deeply.
Yeah. I understand how people can argue that one side or the other does or does not reflect Christian values. That's fine. But that's a different question than saying, does my vote reveal whether or not I think the Bible is trustworthy, whether or not Christ came and died on the cross in a redemptive way, whether or not I'm a sinner? None of those questions are inherently on the ballot. Now, you might think there are implications for those questions when you cast a vote, but that vote is not the gospel. And so I really, these are heated discussions, but I really want people to step back and think, okay, this could be my brother or sister in Christ who's casting this vote. At the end of the day, that vote is not what's going to make, put their name in the Lamb's book at the final judgment. And so I think we got have a little bit of perspective about this.
It's easy to forget there was almost 2,000 years of history prior to American politics.
You're kidding.
You know what I mean? But it's our only lens. And so we're like, boy, my faith is totally defined by something that most people in world history had never heard of.
Correct. That's right.
So I have to be so careful.
Yeah.
Let's do another one.
Yeah. We are very concerned about the outcome of the election, but God is in charge. What happens if it doesn't go our way?
If it doesn't go whatever preferred way you have, God will still be in charge. And, the election results are not going to surprise God. He's not going to wake up the next morning and say, oh no, Kamala Harris is president. I didn't plan for that. Let's reevaluate everything. Or Donald Trump is president. And so it might not go the way that you want. And I would ask people to think back 4 years or 8 years ago when an election did not go the way that you wanted. We're still here. Country's still functioning. Nothing's perfect. Things are always difficult and complicated. it's very unlikely one election is going to be catastrophic for the country. We're much more durable, much more robust than that. Now, I have concerns. I have fears. I'm looking at this with some trepidation as well. But I got to step back, take a little bit of perspective, take a deep breath, and think, these election results at the end of the day are just an election. They don't affect God's sovereignty at all.
And there's an essence in which we ought to yield to the results, as in, it may not be what I like, but I must acknowledge God is sovereign, and he chose this.
And not only that God is sovereign, but let's even make it more practical, that person has been instituted by God, according to Scripture, to lead, and therefore I'm to be honorable, respectful, obedient to the laws as much as they cohere with my ability to do so. And so that leader now becomes someone that I owe something to as a result, whether I agree with them or disagree with them. And I understand that raises some hackles with people, but think back to when Paul's writing to the Roman Christians. They're not in love with Nero.
No, he's using them as torches to light his garden.
And Paul's message is, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Look at Romans 13, verse 7. And as difficult as that is sometimes, I think that's the essential Christian witness. That's what we're called to do. And so I may have strong disagreements with the president, but I still owe them something as a believer.
Yeah, and then again, I think our tendency is to go, yeah, see, those people over there never do that. But I think that's a self-reflective comment. Like if I'm a follower of Jesus and I believe that we're all broken people, my first instinct should be, how can I reflect that in my life? Not why doesn't my neighbor do that?
I think that's right. And I think in an ideal situation, you want that reflection to then encourage your neighbor to pursue God. And you want to encourage your neighbor to see God through you and through your witness. And I think if we're loving, if we're kind, if we're honorable, if we're respectful in the way that we're commanded to be, I think they're going to see God through you. Now, I'll be really honest about it. That's not the best politics. If your goal is just to be politically effective, this is not the best way to do politics. But I don't think Scripture is built around doing politics well. That's not the only concern.
That's awesome. You said a lot there. It's heavy. It's true, though. Some people, like a political scientist, said that. Yeah, he did. Because you love Jesus more than politics.
I mean, I love politics, but you can't idolize it. You can't put it at the center of your life. You can't let it consume you. And I think part of my task is to give people perspective.
Yeah. And again, it's startling, right? Because you actually have dedicated much of your professional life to politics.
For sure.
And you're still willing to say that it shouldn't be the center of your life. And you love it more than most people.
Love. Yeah, I love it. I'm obsessed with it. Sometimes love is hard. It's like a relationship, it's always rocky in some ways. And so it's up and down. But no, I really do. I'm fascinated by it. I love studying it. But I also know on Saturdays, I don't want to obsess over politics. I'll watch my Georgia Bulldogs and go from there.
In studio with us, I can't believe he went all the way here.
Went all the way here.
Came all the way here. Traveled here with his colleague, Mark, who's also fabulous. Mm-hmm. From Cedarville University, we have Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith. Thank you for coming in today.
It really is a lot of fun. I'm always happy to be here. Always happy to talk to you guys on the phone, but being here is a lot more enjoyable.
Oh, don't stop.
But I'm not going to do this every month. So.
Oh.
Come on. But anyway, he's answering your political questions. I have lots, but I'd rather yield to you, sort of.
Yeah, we're not taking yours. We have a lot.
Lauren's making me.
Yeah.
So 440-546-2255.
How do you determine who wins a political debate?
Okay. Most people go into a political debate with their preferences. They watch the debate, and then magically the person they prefer won the debate. That's kind of how most people approach it. And I don't even mean that in a bad way. It's just we all have strong points of view, and we tend to look for confirmation from those points of view, and we just sort of move forward from there. I try to be a little bit more detached from it and try to look at who's dealing with questions, who's actually being forthright, who has a real vision is something I'm concerned about. I want to see who understands reality, who's connected to reality, and who can sort of navigate world affairs and world politics. And I think a debate can reveal some of that. But I think we have to conclude as well that, we're looking at, 2 minutes to talk about Ukraine and Russia. You get 2 minutes. good, go.
Goodness.
What are you going to say? And then you get 2 minutes to rebut, and now we're done, and we're going to move on to whatever. And so it's a really bad format for learning, I think, how people think. It's become a very much a viral thing where you just try to say something that's going to get posted on TikTok or whatever, and that's really the end of it. And so at some level, I don't care who wins. I don't really try to learn from it. I just watch it to see what happens.
Fair enough.
I think it was interesting in the 1960 debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, the people who listened on radio, audio only, felt that, oh, hands down, Richard Nixon won.
Oh, yeah.
The people watching television who had the visual aspect as well, where Nixon was sweating profusely under the hot lights and
And he
stuff.
didn't wear any makeup.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
And they all felt, oh, Kennedy won hands down.
Yeah, there's still a lot of that, of course. I mean, a lot of television debate is about image and putting forward a particular kind of image. And generally, the candidates who put forward a better image have more success when it comes to debates. But I think our approach to images is shifting a bit over time. So it's been interesting to watch the last few election cycles because I think this has gone up and down a bit.
Yeah. What's next, Lauren?
Was it legal how President Biden was removed and Harris took his spot?
Perfectly legal in the sense that the Democratic Party has its own processes, its own policies for how they deal with things. And first, I don't think it's quite fair to say he was removed. I mean, he stepped aside. Now, you could argue he was pressured to step aside, I think, and he ended up caving into that pressure. But there's nothing illegal about it. People could have sued, perhaps, and said, there's a legal problem here. But the courts would have said, as long as they're following the processes that they've laid out, they're bound to their own rules, they follow those rules, then there's really that's all there is to it. So nothing, I don't think anything, a bit of a shock to the system, I think for sure, out of the norm, but nothing illegal.
Has that happened before, where there's been a switch out of candidate that close to the election?
Nothing like this, no. No, we've never seen anything like this before. I mean, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run. That was much earlier in the cycle. There really hadn't been many primaries at that point, and so he just declined to go forward. But I think that was in March or April. This is really late in the season for this kind of thing to happen.
Yeah. All right.
How should a believer vote when they're not satisfied with either candidate? Do we rely on issues, character, or something else?
That's a great question.
It is a great question. I think there are lots of ways to approach it. I think one thing you have to think through is how the political system interprets your vote. And I don't think most people see it from that perspective. They look at it as a statement of their values, which is good, but how does the political system interpret your vote? So if you're going to vote in a state that, say, Donald Trump is going to win by 10 points, like Ohio probably, he's going to win Ohio probably pretty handily unless something really strange happens. Choosing to vote for Trump is just going to sort of get lost in the wash because a bunch of people voted for Trump. Ohio is a red state, and it's really not going to make a big difference for how the system looks at that vote. If Kamala Harris gets lots of votes in Ohio and it's competitive, okay, now the system's going to pay really close attention because we've seen something unexpected. If there are lots of people who vote down the ticket Republican but choose not to vote for Donald Trump at the presidential level, the system will notice that. It really will. And the political consultants and the candidates are going to say, oh boy, we have a real problem because this candidate didn't pull as many votes as other people did on the ticket, which means there are issues that we have to deal with. And if you decide to write in someone, or vote third party, unless those numbers get really big, the system just doesn't care. They just don't pay attention. If it's 1% of the people voted third party, then, it's 1%. We'll just move along. No big deal. So there are your values to consider. There's also what does the system think of what I'm doing? But at the end of the day, I think you have your conscience. You should try your best to abide by your conscience, consider the factors that are in front of you, and make the best choice that you can. I really look at character. I try to think a good bit about character. I also try to think about who's the best fit for the American regime, who's going to uphold constitutional norms and standards, and then who's going to deal with foreign policy, because that's where the president has the most discretion.
There you go.
How many executive orders can the president write?
There's no limit. No limit. Presidents can write none. They can write dozens, hundreds. There's really no limit to it.
How long have they been writing lots of them?
If I recall correctly, I think they really started ramping up in the New Deal. And so we're looking at Roosevelt back in the 30s, who started to use executive orders more dramatically. And I think they've kind of increased a bit over time since then. I'm sure someone's going to fact check and go on Wikipedia and say, what's the number of executive orders? And I'm going to be wrong. But I think,
But George Washington wasn't writing lots of them.
Not lots, no. There were really only a handful over the years, and eventually it kind of exploded. And in some ways it makes sense, because an executive order is really just telling the bureaucracy how to enforce a law. And as the bureaucracy gets bigger and as the government gets more complicated, you could expect executive orders to get more common as well.
Okay.
Does the electoral system make sure smaller populated states have some say-so in elections?
So yeah, I think, we talked about the Electoral College before. I think this is one of the reasons the Electoral College also exists, was to give small states a little bit of a boost in representation. If you look at the numbers of the Electoral College, it's generally based on population. So the Electoral College voters that you have in a state is based on population. But small states get an additional boost because the number of senators are also counted. And so like Wyoming has 3 Electoral College votes, even though they only have
3 people.
Yeah, more livestock than people, but they get 3 Electoral College votes, which gives them a little bit more oomph than they would have just based on population. And so I do think one of the designs of the system is to give small states a bit more input than they would have in a popular vote system. If we just did popular votes, you'd never campaign anywhere except large areas with lots of voters, and that's all you'd care about.
I mean, you'd campaign with California, Texas, New York.
Sure, Florida, and you're going to stick to those big places and just sort of move on. But now they're going to campaign in places that are a little smaller if it's a close election, and that state can go either way.
To what extent did the founders have that in mind when they came up with the Electoral College? Like they were overtly saying, we're worried about tyranny of the majority?
Oh, for sure. And they wanted to also construct a system that would prevent a candidate from being a favorite son, as they would have said. Someone who comes from one state that wins a tons of votes in that state and then is not appealing to the rest of the country but still becomes president. In theory, I know it sounds ridiculous, but in theory, you could be from California, win 99% of the votes in California, lose the rest of the country, but still squeak ahead in the popular vote. I know that sounds ridiculous, but
it's true,
they're trying to avoid sort of a regional candidate that can't appeal broadly across the country.
And so it sounds like it makes sense to have somewhat of a love-hate relationship with the Electoral College, because when it gets to be a close situation where you have more popular vote for someone who wins or who loses.
That's right.
It makes us angry.
Yeah. It does. It makes us angry. I do wish they'd reform it a bit, though. What I would reform, though, is don't make it a winner-take-all system, because right now, in almost every state, if you win the popular vote by 1 vote, you get all the Electoral College votes from that state. I'm not sure that's the best approach. I think we could probably distribute them by congressional district, which would then mean places like California become competitive in the Electoral College, because Donald Trump could actually win some congressional districts in California, squeeze some Electoral College votes out of that, which then make him campaign even more broadly than he does now. So I wish they'd tweak the system a bit to make it a little bit more competitive than what it is, but that's just me.
Okay. Let's do one more and then take a break.
Both candidates claim to have good plans for the economy moving forward. How can we rationally evaluate their strategies?
Okay, that's a really good question that we can't answer really quickly. I wanted to talk about this, though.
Sure.
Because there really are 2 competing economic philosophies on the 2 parties. It's one of the major differences between the 2, sort of. You're saying maybe.
Yeah. They're more similar than people might think. But yeah, we can talk for sure.
In studio with us, Mark Caleb Smith. He is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. Go to cedarville.edu for more. Answering your political questions today. Right before the break, we got a question about the 2 main candidates and their approaches to solving our economic problems. Like, how do we evaluate these?
So I think that I would have said, let's say 20 years ago, that the parties represent fundamentally different economic visions. The Republican Party is looking for small government. They want to promote free enterprise. They want to promote free trade. And they want to reduce the barriers to manufacturing. They want to have, as much free labor as they can get, to sort of not unionize kind of labor. And the Democratic Party is much more willing to intervene with the government, to have higher taxation, more redistribution of income, more social welfare. But I think what you've seen over the last 10 or 12 years is the parties have gotten closer on some of those issues.
Wow.
You don't have a lot of Republicans out there arguing now for a balanced budget. You don't have Republicans out there arguing to reform the social welfare system. No one's talking about Social Security being fixed. No one's talking about Medicare, Medicaid, and fixing those. Think about the debate that we just watched. There was never an argument about that kind of thing. And so I think both parties are now willing to use the government to intervene in the economy. They just want to do it in different ways. The Democrats probably want to be a little bit more reliant on taxation. So have higher taxes on wealthier people and then use that funding to maybe offset deficits or spend on other programs. The Republicans want to use tariffs. They want to use sort of trade policies to impact prices to protect American manufacturing, and then they're thinking that will invigorate the middle class, or I should say the working class. But I think in each of those cases, you're looking at different forms of government intervention, which I think was not the case a couple of decades ago.
See, people throw around that word tariff as if everyone knows what it is. Can you help us understand what a tariff is?
Yeah, and my hopefully none of my economics friends at Cedarville are listening to this, because they're going to start screaming at their radio, because I'm not an expert in this at all. But a tariff is basically a tax that you put on an incoming good. So let's say China wants to send an electronic vehicle to the United States. We slap a 20% tariff on that, which basically forces that manufacturer to pay an extra 20% to bring it into the country.
In theory, that makes American products more affordable.
In theory, it does. In theory, it makes them more competitive. Let's say that, because now that Chinese electronic vehicle is more expensive, which now means the American manufactured car is more competitive with that Chinese vehicle. However, in reality, that also means that if an American wants to buy that Chinese product, they've got to pay 20% more. President Trump seems to think that those tariffs just magically get paid by the country of China, and therefore we get money out of that. When in reality, the manufacturer is going to pass that cost along to the consumers, and then things become more expensive as a result. And so does it protect American jobs? Maybe. And I think you could make that argument, but does it make things more expensive? Definitely. And I would argue tariffs lead to more inflation, which is what we've been fighting recently. So it's not my preferred approach to economics. That's for sure.
440-546-2255.
How do you talk politics with somebody who thinks any news outside of their preferred news source is fake news?
Boy, that's a fantastic question.
You've had to navigate that quite a bit, I'd imagine.
That's kind of what I do every day, often. Although, to be fair, many students don't consume a lot of political news, so it isn't as big of a deal with students, at least. I think that's one of the most important issues that our country faces right now, is
Amen.
that we're not dealing with shared reality, because we're looking at different sources of information, and therefore we're not functioning in the same way as a country because we're disputing each other's facts. And so what I try to do is encourage people to get outside of their silo a little bit and to consume information that comes from another perspective. If it's clear to me that they've been captured, whether it's on the right or the left, to the point where they really aren't connected to reality, it's difficult to have a conversation. It's just difficult because you can't establish a common ground. And so I try to encourage them to expand their media diet a little bit. If you want to listen to podcasts, find a couple of podcasts on the other side of the aisle. If you want to subscribe to a newspaper, which I know is anathema to many people, you're going to make me pay for news. Well, I think paying for things that are good is a perfectly good way to approach life. Paying for your coffee usually gets you better coffee than free coffee. No offense to you. I had free coffee this morning. It was fine.
That's so true, though.
But it's true, right? So I think you pay for a product that's worth paying for, and paying for good news is well worth it, and it's not expensive. So I would say pay for some news on the right, pay for some news on the left, pay for the Wall Street Journal, pay for the Washington Post or the New York Times. They have different views of the world to some extent, but I think when you consume both of those things, you start to understand they have different perspectives, and you start to see some truth maybe mixed in on both sides. And so, and I would avoid sort of extreme sites, and I would certainly avoid social media as a source of information, because it's just not, social media is not a trustworthy place to go to get informed.
And I've heard many people say I miss the olden days when we had unbiased news. And you're laughing.
I mean, it was a little more unbiased. I would agree with that. It was more objective, but it was also, it was biased in other ways. It wasn't necessarily ideologically biased, but it was biased toward other interests. And so the New York Times might have tried to see both sides of the perspective, but they also had a very strong institutional bias that favored themselves in some ways. And so we should look for objective news. I think we really should look for detached and objective news. But we also have to understand that everybody struggles with objectivity. And so multiple sources are, I think, the best way to go about it.
And I like finding people who, based on who they are and what they believe, give unexpected answers. If I'm reading someone and I can predict what their position will be on something based on their party, I don't have as much respect for that person.
No, I think you're exactly right. And I'll give one example, which people may be familiar with. CNN has a commentator named Van Jones. Van Jones is a longtime Democratic Party operative and does a lot of commentating for CNN. But every now and then he'll throw something out. and it doesn't fit with party orthodoxy, and it's controversial. And I'm like, I think at the end of the day, Van Jones is trying to tell the truth. Even though I don't always agree with him, I think he's trying to say what he thinks is reality, even if it doesn't fit with other people around him. And I respect that. And so I agree with you. People who are willing to take a little bit of heat, say things that are sometimes unpopular, probably means they're driven by something other than just fitting in. And if you're driven by fitting in, you're not giving quality information.
Very good. 440-546-2255.
If the president doesn't have the power to pass laws, what does the president have power to do?
Not as much as you think.
No. I mean, that's one of my great regrets as a political scientist is I've tried to persuade people that the president's not a monarch, but they really want to invest that kind of power in the president. We want him to be able to wave a wand and just do whatever the president wants to do. And heavens, the founders wanted to avoid that kind of government at all costs. And so presidents have grown far too much in power. However, they're still not all powerful at all. They have a lot more power in foreign policy because they're not as checked in that area. And so they can make decisions about using the military, for example, without a lot of congressional input. They can decide how to enforce laws. They can certainly open diplomatic relations. They can open trade agreements. They can do lots of things in foreign affairs that just sort of don't have an obvious congressional limitation. They do have, I think their biggest power is their power over the public consciousness. They have that bully pulpit. They have that one voice that can penetrate all the chaos in a way that no other government actor can do. And I think that makes them uniquely powerful to drive an agenda. And so if you have a good leader at the presidential level who's willing to drive an agenda, they can make a big difference. But even then, they're going to run up against Congress. They're going to run up against real world events, and their agenda is going to face controversy and resistance. And so you should never elect someone under the assumption they're going to be able to do what they actually say, because life's a lot more complicated than that.
And presidents aren't that powerful.
Not really, no. They're operating in a government that has many different points of power, and they're just one of them.
I recently heard a quote saying Christians should care about politics because it affects policy, and policy affects people. What are your thoughts on that, and how would you recommend Christians get involved in politics?
What's the quote? One more time. I want to process that more.
Christians should care about politics because it affects policy, and policy affects people.
Okay.
I think that's a fair place to start. I think you can take this too far, but I think policy is one way that we can sort of demonstrate love to neighbor. We really want to have a society, and we want to have laws in our society that allow people to flourish and allow them to live a good life. And we should go to the polls voting to encourage government to pass policies that allow us to live a good life. And we should be involved just out of concern for our neighbors and love for our neighbors. And so I think we should be involved. However, I think there's a real risk to looking at politics as a way to solve problems. It does affect people. But so many of our problems, I think, precede politics. Our problems are cultural, that then the culture affects the political system in a way that it's difficult to solve just through policy. Barack Obama always used to say, that gangbanger in Chicago who fires blindly into a crowd, that's not a policy problem. That young man has a hole in his soul. And I think he's right. Like, at the end of the day, I want policies to affect that situation, but there's something else going on there. And that's not a political issue. And so as believers, I think we can get caught up in this idea that politics is going to solve these fundamental questions. It's not.
Says a political scientist. Huh.
Yeah.
No, but it's so true.
Not. Yeah, it's not. And so it's limited in what it can do. And I think we should approach it with that limited mindset.
Do you think it hinders U.S. democracy to only have two major parties?
Our system, this is a really complicated question, believe it or not.
Because the founders didn't want parties,
They
right?
did not want parties and didn't
George
anticipate.
Washington didn't.
No, didn't anticipate parties. That's probably the great flaw of the Constitution, is they didn't anticipate parties emerging and changing the system to some extent. Washington despised parties. He warns in his farewell address about partisanship just capturing people to the point where it just forces them into these weird positions, and it kind of sounds familiar, right? It's kind of how the world works now. I think it might be healthy if we had multiple parties, but our system really isn't designed for that, because we have winner-take-all elections at the local level. And so when you're voting for a member of Congress, let's say, that person has to win enough votes in order to win the seat and then go to Washington. That kind of winner-take-all system tends to yield two stable parties. That's just the way it has worked historically and politically throughout the world. A system that's designed differently, where you allocate seats proportionally, let's say, where You have 100,000 votes in a district. One person wins 30%, another person wins 35%, someone else wins 20%. Well, then 3 people get to go because they represent a chunk of that district. That's a different system that yields multiple parties. And so the way that we structure it is probably going to be a 2-party system unless we have significant changes. And I wouldn't mind to see those changes, but it's not going to happen with what we have right now.
Isn't it more of a parliamentary system would allow that?
It
like,
is.
Like what Europe has primarily,
Yeah,
right?
most of the European countries are parliamentary in their approach, and so they're building coalitions, and it's just a different approach to governance. And I think it has some strengths, but the weaknesses there is constructing the coalition can sometimes make the party very, very weak and difficult to do anything at all. But it's not like we're really doing a lot right now with our parties.
No, before we had parties, wasn't it that the second place winner became vice president?
Yeah. So the initial Electoral College system was the president's the one that gets the most Electoral College votes, vice president gets the second most. And so you ended up with like Thomas Jefferson functioning as vice president to John Adams, which did not go well.
Because they didn't like each other.
Didn't like each other, represented different political philosophies. Jefferson basically runs the opposition party out of the executive branch. It was a bit of an explosive situation. So we amended the Constitution to change that.
Isn't
And
that
was
wild?
Good choice.
People don't even know that. It's just wild.
Mm-hmm.
Should we do one more, Lauren? Please, one more.
Sure. Well, now I have to find one that would work that's short.
I could always ask one.
Go ahead, Brian. I know you want to.
So, women world leaders. Margaret Thatcher, Angela Merkel, Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi. The world has had female leaders.
Yeah.
United States hasn't. I'm not advocating for or not
Sure.
on this. I'm just curious, why the uniqueness of America in this?
That's a really good question. I think that, first of all, I think women were given the right to vote, 1920, if I recall correctly, with the 19th Amendment. And so it has been relatively recent for generations of women to be in the political system to be competitive for the presidency. So I think if you look at women who are credible presidential candidates, you're probably going back to the 80s and 90s as really the first wave of women who are really in that position to run effectively. I think it's just kind of been accidental since then, honestly. I don't think it's really a conspiracy. I don't think there's some sort of cultural norm against it necessarily. And I think, and it may not be this year, but I think it's going to happen very, very soon. I just don't see a lot of significant cultural opposition to it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see it. So I don't think it's because of how America is. I just think it's random.
I wonder if it's also partially due to the answer to your last question.
Could
that
be.
In a parliamentary system, you can have many more leaders.
It could be. Yeah, it could be to some extent. But, like Thatcher took over one of the major parties, and it was kind of unheard of in Britain at that point. And so it could very well be the product of a 2-party system. But I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, we'll stop.
I've saved the questions. You will be asked more another time.
I'm always happy to do it. It's a lot of fun, seriously. And those are really great questions. I appreciate the listeners.
And we're grateful for you and your shared passion of ours, which is nonpartisanship and putting Jesus first. And I think in that, we've seen a lot of texts as well of people appreciative that we can have a level-headed conversation without screaming and awkward rhetoric and just actual serious talk.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And that's one of my goals is to try to pull the venom out of these kind of discussions and have a good, rational, pleasant conversation, regardless of where people come on a perspective.
Again, that's Dr. Mark Caleb Smith. He's Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center for Political Studies. And do you run the cafeteria as well?
Oh my God.
No?
Please no.
No?
Please no.
He doesn't do that, but all those other things he does at Cedarville University. Again, Cedarville University. For more information about the school, not too far from here, go to cedarville.edu. Again, cedarville.edu. Thank you and your colleague Mark for coming all the way in today. We really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun. We'll do it again.